Are we surprised that the Critical Role people made a narrative focused game? No. This is gonna be a lengthy one because I tried Daggerheart, so let's talk about it, shall we? Usual beginning disclaimers. I've only played this twice, so twice does not make me an expert. And one of those times was with version 1.2 of the beta, whatever. I don't know why it has a 1 if it's a beta. But anyway, and then once with the 1.3 updates, but I definitely didn't get them all right. So let's just talk about it because they immediately released updates after, I think it was the same day that we had played the first time. I did play this with 2 separate groups, and the makeup of those groups was different as well. Those were all played on the Cantrips Canteen Discord. So if you were hoping to get in on a Daggerheart playthrough when they release, I'm sure they'll release more playtest stuff. So we might be playing again, and you can sign up when, I release that kind of stuff right on the Discord channel. So go join that. I was only a GM this time. Last time when I tried the MCDM one, I got the opportunity to do both the GM side and the player side. This time I was just the GM. So some of my stuff is more skewed towards that portion because I didn't actually play. But I did try to get as much feedback from my players as I could to kind of incorporate it in this video for you. I have watched Critical Role stuff. This is different from MCDM. I was really big into the campaigns 1 and 2. I watched up until episode 40 of campaign 3 and then had a baby and, life kind of took over. So I'm really far behind, and I just watched a spoiler today, in fact, from last week, but we won't get into that. Regardless, I have been aware that they've been creating their own tabletop game. I understand their play style, which I think is important for my review. I just feel like that's important overall to me coming at this as someone who has been a fan of Critical Role. So I'm going to try not to let that bias, rub into this at all. I will not be going over the rules in any fashion. 1, because it changed already. But 2, there are plenty of videos out there. If you want to go learn how to play the game, just go to Critical Role's crap and watch that. I also know that I did things incorrectly at times because when I went back to review some of the rules, I realized I was doing certain things wrong. But that's okay, that's what the playtest is for, and I'm not an expert in this. Plus, I wasn't going to memorize the 400-page document that they sent out, so there's that. This is obviously not a sponsored video. No one asked for my opinion, but I'm giving it anyway. And I do what I want. This video is gonna go over mostly 1.2 because I have the most thoughts on that. And then at the end, I'll talk about what the differences are between 1.2 and 1.3 and how, things I liked and things I didn't. I'm gonna try to keep this short, but I will put timestamps down below if you wanna hop around to whatever part is more interesting to you. But let's dive in by first talking about the 2 different groups. Like I said, they were different makeups of groups. The first group that I did with the 1.2 version, I told them to just pick the pre-made characters. This is because I thought it would be easier for me to run, having their character sheets and just knowing what to expect out of them, that kind of thing. The first group was very heavy on the role play. I just know that they have a history of being pretty good at role playing. And so all of the people who were in that group, this game felt like it was almost made for them. Are we surprised that the Critical Role people made a narrative focused game? No. Freaking Critical Role. What kind of game were you expecting? So that group did really well with the roleplay aspects. The second group was only 3 players. We had, unfortunately, one who wasn't able to make it. She's a very good role player as well. And they were good at role playing, but they had never played games together. That particular group, the first group, they all had connections within the groups. They all kind of knew each other or had played once or twice before. The second group, they were all new to each other, and I think that did mess with the synergy a bit. They still did really good with a narrative-focused game, so I don't blame them for that, but I do think that did contribute to the gameplay a little bit. We played virtually, and I asked for them to play with cameras on because I am a person who, 1, I talk with my hands. I end up showing everything on my face, and I think that helps my players out when role-playing with me, but I also find it's easier to role-play with someone if I can see their face and I can interact with them. That's why we played with cameras on, but we didn't record because I didn't want any undue pressure on having to get the rules right or anything like that, even though they said that you could stream Daggerheart. We did use Foundry for maps and to roll for the second game. I let them roll physical dice because I like physical dice in the first game, but obviously there is no system set up for Foundry. I just used D&D and then we kind of edited it and just kind of went from there. They were not required to print out the cards or print out their character sheets. They had a PDF version, or the second group used Demiplane, which we'll also talk about towards the end. Editor KYLIE here, interjecting for a moment. The reason I am talking about the makeup of the two different groups is not every tabletop game is meant for every type of group. And since Daggerheart felt very narrative focused, I think it's one of those tabletop games you might have to have the right group for, because there are some people who don't really want that narrative focused thing. And there are people who want, you know, more of this, just the combat, the number crunchy bits. So that's why I think it's important to understand the two groups that I had. First, the 1.2 group was a group of people who were familiar with each other as well as very familiar with tabletop games. The second group, less familiar with each other, still experienced players, but I think that contributes. So in my preparation for this video, but my preparation for Daggerheart as well, I watched a bunch of reviews. One comment stood out to me in particular, that this was supposed to be a rules light game. And I don't know if Matt Mercer actually said that, or if anybody at Critical Role or Darrington Press actually said it was supposed to be rules light, because I'll be honest, I just didn't look it up. But even then, one of the reviewers I watched was claiming that because they sent a 400-page document, that it was definitely not a rules light game. But to me, it did feel more rules light, or at least the rules felt more loosey-goosey to me. And I feel like that's on brand for them. It felt like the rules were just guidelines, right? So it was just a lot of, well, here's how you could do it, but you don't have to kind of idea. That, or I'm playing wrong, which is also highly possible. The only thing I'm vaguely aware of is that Mercer said that it was supposed to be a narrative-focused D&D game, and that is definitely what they created. It's not necessarily rules light, but it did feel to me like the rules were not as important as the story that you were telling. I also think that the review that I watched, that guy didn't actually play the game, so he was just going off of the 400-page document, which does look rules heavy. So let's talk about the character creation process. Now, again, I didn't do this in particular. I did watch the Critical Role video on it, and then I did make my own, like remade a couple characters of my own in Demiplane just to kind of get a feel for it, but I didn't make them in person or anything like that. I did think it was interesting because there are so many options to really tailor your character. It does feel like it's missing certain things, like there's no warlock, and I tried to build my warlock character in it and it just didn't work, but I got my druid and my ranger, so it was fine. But I just think having that many options for your heritage and your experiences and things like that, that really does round out your character really well, and it does help for a narrative focused game. So I did really enjoy that. Some of my players did create characters. My second group did, and I think what I learned from that was it's very hard to create characters without sitting down and doing it together. They all made characters on Demiplane and they did it separately. They didn't really talk together about it. So we ended up having two guardians, which was fine because they ended up picking very different things. And so it was very interesting to have two characters of the same class doing similar things to a point, but they were still completely different builds. And I found that actually like a very interesting happenstance. I do think you would have to have like a session 0 just for character creation so that you guys can all talk and say, well, I'm gonna pick this domain because of this, I want this heritage because of this, and then like balance it between characters since there is overlap between each class when it comes to domain powers. I also really enjoyed that they had this connections questions section. However, I liked it better on the adventure itself than in Demiplane, but I just liked the prompts in the adventure. It did feel like I didn't have to think about it as a DM. I didn't have to prep something else, that it was given to me, and it was just easy for my players to have connections. And then that first group that played, that were very heavy in the roleplay, they actually leaned into those answers to those questions a lot throughout the game to really have their characters have interactions between them. And it was very, very interesting to see. Whereas the second group, they had a goal and they all agreed to how they were connected, but it just didn't push them. And that's partially because the adventure had things like, I envy blank because of this, or I wish I was more like this character. And I think that kind of lends itself differently than how do you know someone, or don't remember what the questions were, but they just weren't as memorable. Let's talk about the card system. I've seen some mixed feelings on the card system, and I did not use cards. I had document out and it was all virtual, so we didn't have to print them and cut them and all of that. However, I can totally see how they would be useful. And I also had one player who did print out all her stuff and her domain cards and everything and had them out. And she said it was so much easier and figure out what move she wanted to do. And she would just set it aside and know when it was her turn what she would do. And it made combat faster for her. And I can totally see this happening. If you've ever played Gloomhaven, that's kind of the same feel. Some people don't like the idea of cards because they think it's going to be a cash grab, maybe turning into a Wizards of the Coast thing with magic cards or something. I don't see this happening. And part of that is, again, if we look at things like Gloomhaven, which is like a tabletop game, a tabletop role-playing game to an extent, you just buy all the cards in the game. It is very expensive, but once you have them, that's it. They do have a couple packs here and there you can buy in addition to that game if you want. But the base stuff has everything you need. And I feel like that's the direction Daggerheart is taking, where they're just going to give you a base set. And then I bet you, in a year or so, they come up with new ancestries or new domain cards and they release those as well. And then you could buy those and it'd be just like buying a book. And I would hope, but this is just me hoping, that when they sell either a book with those class options and stuff, they also include the cards for you. But, who knows what that'll look like later on. I also think having the cards just makes it easier. Instead of flipping through the book to find the section on your class and then going through the paragraphs of information to figure out what feature you're looking for, you literally have them on cards right in front of you. And you don't have to go through the book. You don't have to shift through all of the other information from the other classes. You don't have to pass the book around because you only have one or two at the table. You just have your cards right in front of you. And I think having all the details right there makes it so much easier. This also is one of the things that sets the game apart, is the card system. Now, obviously, there are plenty of games out there who also have card systems, but I find it interesting, but on brand for Darrington Press, who also has other board games and things. So I did actually enjoy the cards. Even though I didn't get to use them, I feel like they are a great addition to the game and can actually speed up combat and gameplay. This one tidbit comes from spellcasters in the group. Apparently, when having the cards, it makes it so much easier to play a spellcaster. And I can totally see why. Instead of having 20 to 40 different spells in your list, you only can have 5 in your hand at a time. You can spend some time, I believe, and I'm gonna botch all the terminology, but you can spend some time to swap out your domain cards from your vault and move things around. There's not as many, especially starting, that it kind of makes it easier to just jump into a sorcerer or a wizard. Instead of in D&D, if we're trying to introduce a player to D&D, we just tell them to play a fighter or a barbarian or something that doesn't have as many of those aspects to worry about because it's just easier. Obviously, you can argue for or against that kind of push into that. But that's what I saw, especially when I was first starting to play D&D, is that everybody said the easiest class to play was a barbarian. It's interesting to see this game where you could pick up any class and you have just as many cards as everybody else. It doesn't feel like you have a lot to remember just based on that. Let's talk about the action card and initiative, because I think this is the big one that everybody's like talking about, is the initiative. Because it's very similar to MCDM in some ways, and apparently to original D&D didn't have initiative either, I have learned in recent weeks. But regardless, it has no initiative, and it just essentially swaps between the players and the DM. In this particular game, in Daggerheart, players spend a token. The token goes on the action tracker, and then once they fail or they roll with fear, that makes it the GM's turn, and then they can use the tokens that they placed on that card to make moves and actions with their tokens, only allowing one per monster or NPC. At first I was nervous about this because when I played MCDM, everybody was kind of silent. We had a good group. It was a very similar group to some of the same people even. And we had a good group, but it did seem like combat took a while still because we had to keep track of who went when, and it was too hard to keep track of. When I played the first part, 1.2, we didn't really keep track of who went, but we didn't have as much of a hard time with it. I felt like combat was moving so quickly, and part of it was everybody was waiting for me to do something, because a GM can essentially spend fear to jump in to the middle of any of the player's actions so they can interrupt a player and do something. And because that aspect of the game was there, and they had also in the first play test, they had accrued a lot of fear, so I had a lot of tokens at my disposal and they were just waiting for me to hop in, and that actually made the game and the combat really tense, and that made them pay attention the entire time. I don't think that anybody really hesitated when it was their turn. They were eager to jump in when it was the player's round. So I do think that combat and this action card and no initiative system is pretty good. I don't know, I'd have to play it more often, of course, and I can see there are some disadvantages to it. Let's talk about some of those. So obviously, one major complaint I'm seeing online in general is the question, what's preventing a player like someone who's a hard hitter to continuously take the action for the player's turn, to just keep going and going and going? We didn't have that with either group, and that stemmed from two different things. For the first group, all of them were willing to step back and allow other players to be in the spotlight. So I didn't have any spotlight hogs in this group. I had people who were actively trying to make sure that people took their turns. And that was really good to see. The overall group was just willing to work with each other and even do tag team actions, which made for some really cool moments. And if you're trying Daggerheart, make sure you try this tag team action thing, because essentially you can spend 3 hope and you and another player both do an action, but you do just one roll with advantage and you just go. It can do massive amounts of damage, but you're only allowed to do it once per session. So it's a great way to be cinematic and, action focused while still keeping the narrative. And we had a lot of fun with it. We had 2 really good maneuvers that happened during the adventure in the first one. But my second group didn't know how to interact with each other. And I think part of that was they didn't know the character builds of each other. And so they had a harder time figuring out tag teams. They didn't know each other as much too. So that synergy kind of hurt a little bit there. It is something I think you have to have a good group for to do those tag team things, but they can be really cool. That first group let everybody have a turn. They were watching each other. The second group, I ended up doing something that was suggested by the first group, which was having colored tokens for each player. And then they would put the token near the action tracker when they had taken their turn. And then they wouldn't be able to take a turn until they could spend that token again, which would go back after everybody had spent their colored token. I had to have 2 different kinds of tokens because I wanted some tokens on the action tracker for every action, but you can spend those. So I didn't want to accidentally spend the colored tokens and then we not know what the order was in. Apparently in Critical Role, and I don't know this because I didn't watch the full session that they had, but in Critical Role, they put their tokens next to it when they took a turn and then took it back when everybody had taken a turn. This is the solution to that if you're really worried about it. Also, though, there's nothing keeping you from having all of your monsters gang up on one player. You can counter it however you want. I understand that people are looking, though, for a more concrete rule or calling on that. The interesting thing I found was that initiative kind of evens itself out. My first group had 5 players, my second group had 3 players, and the monsters were the same, which, a caveat, I still use the adventure from the 1.2 update, even though they hadn't updated to 1.3. So who knows, the monsters might have been a little OP, and we did talk about it after the game, and we didn't think it was that overpowered because it did end up still being a challenge equal to what my first group saw. So initiative evens itself out though, because you as a GM can't take moves unless they spend action tokens. So if they put a bunch of action tokens on the action tracker, those are the only 3 that you can use. Because I was a little bit worried that, I'd have a lot of enemies to gang up on them. That second group also didn't go through a whole section because, narratively speaking, they kind of skipped the whole tavern section because they made good decisions and rolled well. They ended up not creating as much fear that I could use later. The first group kept rolling a lot of fear, and I had a lot of fear tokens, and it was making them nervous the whole time. So let's talk about the adventure module a little bit. The Quickstart Adventure they give you is pretty short. My first group went through it in 4.5-ish hours, almost 5 hours, although we did BS a little bit in the beginning. And then the second group went for about 3.5 to 4 hours. I actually really liked the Quickstart Adventure, not just the overall style and the world it kind of hints at, but the whole thing has built-in prompts for the DM to ask. And I know what you're gonna say. DMs are supposed to ask some of these questions throughout the game. That's what makes a DM good. But the fact that I didn't have to think about them, the fact that I didn't have to prep or ask people, that it was literally just built into what I was reading to them, made it so much easier. That also lends itself to kind of a beginner-friendly environment for a DM who's never run a game before, because you're teaching them those habits early on. And so I hope that they release more modules that are official that kind of include those little hints, since this is a narrative-focused game, and so many people want to have DMs and GMs that are like Matt Mercer, and it's not necessarily something everyone can do, and D&D doesn't really guide you as easily. You could read the whole DMG, but this kind of gave you just one quick question you could ask the players and then get their feedback and roll with it. That really could help a beginner DM. To me, it was like they handed me these questions on a silver platter and I just gobbled them up, really, because it was just so useful, especially towards the end of the game, where I've been talking for 3 hours straight and I can't find words anymore, because I'm usually very tired by the end. I normally try to cut off sessions by 3.5 hours because I am spent, and having those questions and those prompts to help me through really was something I wish happened in more adventure modules. I'm just going to talk about the monsters that were in the adventure, because I didn't really look at any monsters that they might have provided in the rulebook, because again, I don't have time to read a 400-page book. Just mama ain't got time. So I think they were all different enough, and I did like how they were built. I did enjoy their abilities. They all had unique ones and they didn't have too many, so it wasn't like I had to read a stat block that was this big. It was like 1 or 2 lines, and I did enjoy that. But again, they were all kind of minion-y. Minion-y? Ooh, ah. I don't know how that would be for big boss battles or any bigger enemies, but overall my feelings with the monsters were pretty good. I think I'd have to mess around with more. I'd also would love to see any homebrew related things created in this world with their idea of monsters. So I think I'd have to play around with that more. This is obviously a game meant for role playing. The combat was fine and it really went through quickly. And I think that the characters leaned into those connections they made in the beginning in the creation process to role play their hits and things better. But, you know, I'm not a good DM. Some of those things like asking about the connections and asking about things they see in the forest or whatever, those prompts that they give you is super obvious, especially in hindsight. I'm not always good at remembering to do those things, to prompt for those things. I mean, if you've watched any of my streams, you'll see that it's not me that makes those streams. It is totally my players that make the whole thing. I stammer a bunch, I stumble over my words, I repeat myself a lot, and overall I feel like I'm just but it's not about me, it's about my players. And as long as they're enjoying it and they're able to get what they want out of it, I find that it really doesn't matter. I'm just kind of the referee here, you know? But I digress. Based on the combat and the way that they've written the Quickstart Adventure, this is definitely narrative focused, and they did a good job of making it such. Let's talk about Demiplane for a little bit. So I did mention that I created characters there. This is essentially, I mean, it's comparative to D&D Beyond. In fact, the style of it is really good. I didn't know that Pathfinder was on there, so hopefully more games use Demiplane, honestly. It was pretty intuitive to create a character in there, but it didn't update stats I had to keep refreshing my second group because they used Demiplane for their characters. And anytime I wanted to see what their stress was at or something, I'd have to click refresh and like reopen the page to see those changes. I don't know about real-time rolling otherwise too, as we didn't use that for it. We used Foundry. I can't comment on all the functionality. I did like that you could put your feedback on the playtest right into Demiplane. My thoughts are it's probably just as good as D&D Beyond, but I'd have to play around with it more. And I don't even use D&D Beyond as much. I just import characters from D&D Beyond into Foundry. So most of the time I don't even use that system. I don't know fully how it compares to that, but at first glance and at my initial play around with character creation in there, it's pretty comparable. So let's touch on some of the differences between the 1.2 and the 1.3 update that they had and how I kind of feel about them. So there were a lot of changes and a lot of them were on the classes and the abilities, and I didn't look at any of that because there's a lot and I didn't make any characters. So I kind of didn't care about that. However, there were certain changes that I did really like. So they changed how advantage was rolled. So instead of just rolling and taking the better roll, like rolling twice and taking the better roll, you actually just rolled another hope die. And this made it more likely for you to get like a crit, because a crit would be 2 of the same on your 2 d12s. And then it also made it more likely to roll with hope because you're rolling 2 hope die. So you would hopefully pick the die that had the higher number. And I do think that was a good change, and I hope that they stick to that. Disadvantage is the same, except you roll the 2 hope and then you take the lesser of the 2 every time. But yeah, I do think this is a good idea for Advantage, like a good change based on the first edition of Advantage. Helping also change in the same way. So instead of both of them rolling for their action and taking the better roll, the person initiating the help rolled, and then the other person rolled 1d12, which was an additional hope die. So again, it's the same thing as Advantage, just flavored a little differently. And I think that would have worked too, but my second group didn't really do tag team efforts. I do like the change that the stress doesn't affect your HP. I like it. It does feel similar to MCDM's victory points then too, except the opposite, you know, stress and fear. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it did feel similar. Then spending fear was also different, but I wasn't as good at keeping track of it in the second playtest, so I can't really comment on that. And then there were a whole bunch of other updates that I'm pretty sure I just couldn't wrap my head around, or was like, I don't know, in La La Land when I was playing the second time. So I don't think I can accurately comment on all of those. But I do think spending the fear, I was doing wrong the entire time the second time. The changes that they made kind of makes it so you have more to spend fear on, but you get less fear. And I just don't know how I feel about that, to be honest. My overall thoughts on this are you know, Daggerheart kind of put a dagger right in my heart. So this is obviously a game built for roleplay. And I mean, really, were we expecting anything else from Critical Role? No. This narrative focused game does speed up combat, which I enjoy because I hate 5e combat. I think the mechanics really slow down the narrative. I do think they're necessary mechanics because I don't want to figure it out. But I do think that the turns are just so slow, and that really detracts from the overall play and feel of the game. Whereas this one, everybody seemed to be so focused. Everybody seemed to be ready to take their turn. Combat flew by. I did not feel that undue pressure that someone was waiting quiet and didn't know what to do, which I often get as DM when I'm running games and have encounters and monster battles. I can tell when someone's not really paying attention. Feel like I didn't have that as much in Daggerheart as I would in a normal game. So far, I'm impressed. Everybody is like talking about the next big thing after D&D, and people are moving away from D&D after all of the stuff that has been going on. I don't know if this is the game for me that I would switch to necessarily. It is highest on the rung at the moment since I do love the narrative focused genre of gameplay, but we'll see what it turns out to be in a few months. So let me know in the comments, have you played Daggerheart? What did you think of it? How does it compare to other newer games coming out like MCDM? And I'd love to hear from people who've played both and what your take on the initiative system is. And I'd also love to know if there's any other big games. I can't try there's so many games coming out, guys. I can't try every single one, but I'd be interested to know if there's any that you think I should look into. I've heard like the D20 system or a Dungeon 20, I don't know what it is one that I should be looking into. But you guys, if you can drop some hints down below as what you guys would like me to review next in terms of games, let me know, and I will see you guys in the next one.